Welcome to the General Liability Case Study Part 2. These webinars are brought to you by the Transportation Risk Specialists Motor Carrier Insurance Education Foundation. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat window. They will be answered as the time allows, or we'll respond with after the webinar with a email to you, and if appropriate, share your questions with everyone. If you experience auto problems or any other problems, send a note in the chat window or call our office, 800-741-4084. We'll attempt to correct these problems as soon as possible. You all have been provided an outline to follow the PowerPoint discussion. This was asked for by a couple people, and we agree that it is appropriate. The outline does not necessarily have all the slides that you'll see on the PowerPoint presentation, but they will be the recaps and also some more policy information there. As part one, we made sure that we would understand how the different insurers know the difference between liability coverage, and the statement I made was that they really don't know. They just say, here I am, cover my assets. There is an overlapping in the protection of insurers from liability claims or liability exposures from the GL, the auto, the work comp, inland marine, which is a Bailey policy, which is a cargo policy, and professional liability. The comment that I made earlier, and I will emphasize it today even more with the discussion of how the GL works with auto liability, is that you cannot write any one of these coverages, particularly GL liability, in a vacuum. In other words, if the insured has exposure, then you need to make sure there's coverage with that exposure, or you might bring some of the exposures back onto the GL policy or the other policy that you're writing that you do not intend to do. We made sure that when we list in the first hour section the name insured on item 1 of the declaration. This is the business. The businesses are involved in first an individual. That will be denoted as a DBA. And in those cases, because of the who's insured provisions and other things we went to, you can have unexpected exposures from personal actions beyond just the business you're insured, because the entity's name is the legal entity, not the DBA. The DBA is not a legal entity. In the other forms of businesses, partnership, corporation, LLCs, you do not have to name the partners, owners, stockholders, members, or officers, directors, or managers on the name insured line. They have all the protection they need in the policy already without naming them, and therefore you limit the exposure to the business and not bring the personal activities in. All liability policies, both general liability and auto liability, provide protection to the owners of the business in the forms already without naming them on the name insured line. This protection is for them owning the legal entities that they are operating. We talked about providing insurance to the motor carrier. Do you do it as a standalone or a package with auto liability? A lot of the carriers that we're dealing with in the special market have packaged the auto liability and the general liability together, which later in this presentation will tell you is a good thing. The problem we have in some cases is that some of the general liability policies that you'll be provided by a motor carrier will be provided on non-admitted paper. For you who are not familiar with the difference in admitted and not admitted, the admitted paper is the insurance carriers who are licensed to do business in that state and that are providing coverage on quote standard, unquote forms. Not admitted carriers are not licensed by the state to do business in that state. However, they have the rights to do business in that state, and their policies they write are not necessarily always standard ISO forms. There'll be endorsements added that will limit coverage or expand coverage. So I'm encouraging you, both whether it's admitted or not admitted. In my personal opinion, the difference is immaterial. There is some concern about the guarantee funds, that any omitted paper, if the insurance company becomes insolvent, then any claims would fall in the guarantee fund, where the non-omitted paper does not. But this does not relieve, I believe, the agents to make sure that the insurance carriers they're doing business with are solid financially. For most guarantee funds, the possible maximum payout for any one policy is $300,000, which, as you know, is lower than most limits that you will write. So therefore, this does not provide you any assurance that your insured will be taken care of. So the difference between non-admitted and admitted paper is only what forms you have, and where there are standard ISO forms or where there are special endorsements by individual carriers, and do those endorsements lead to other limitation of coverages or additional coverages. Also, how they approach the audit situation. We made a comment that all motor carriers need general liability, but all do not buy. We had some discussions in a couple of classes we did about how many of your insurers with less than 5 power units buy a general liability policy. Very few do. And so the first thing I would hope that you would take these series of classes that we have, presentation we have done, to encourage your insureds to need a GL policy. We'll talk more about that cost and how to provide it later. Most of the smaller risks work out of their house or a farm. It's a rural area. They don't often purchase GL. I encourage you to always offer GL. The concern you have is that their personal coverages, meaning on their farm and or on their home, particularly the home, would not cover these exposures that we're talking about that arise out of their operation of their business of a motor carrier. The medium-sized 5 to 25 truck owners, locations that include record keeping and places to store equipment and parts, they might have a small service area. They even might work on servicing owner-operators units. It's easier to provide GL here because a lot of times their lessor, the person who owns the property they're renting if they don't own it themselves, or their customers will require locations, and that will help them. Obviously, the larger risk, the 25 plus, they will have a dispatcher office, a bookkeeping office, a garage to service theirs, and other storage areas, in some cases a warehouse, and even parking spaces. They must have GL to meet their customers' needs. They cannot go on the premises of their customers without this coverage. We're going to talk about in the last section the concern of meeting customers' needs and the contractual coverage. At that location, though, you need to make sure that you have defined all the exposures. One of the things, again, that we'll talk about in the last section when we talk about underwriting this risk is check what the location through Google Earth or one of those satellite picture to make sure that you understand everything that's on the insured's location. Let's look at the policy wording, and in the outline you have, you'll see that we duplicated this on you on the bottom of the page. The part here is, that the key part here is that we cover the bodily injury property damage to which this insurance applies. It applies if not excluded, and that is a key consideration. And there are 2 ways to exclude coverages, either by, or 3 ways I guess, either by the exclusions in the policy, by adding an endorsement, or by having a endorsement that calls about classification limitation endorsement, which limits the coverage only to one set of classifications. In absence of a limitation of classification, then the policy will cover everything the insured does, whether you know about it or not at policy inception, except for material representation. And so we have to look at these 2 elements to determine if what the GL policy has a responsibility to pay or not to pay. And that would be the exclusions in the policy and any endorsements that are added that will take coverage away. So when you remember this part, that it is covered in GL policy unless there's an exclusion that takes a coverage away, and or there is an endorsement that's added that modifies or reduces or the coverage. We also have a right and duty to defend seeking any damages for bodily injury or property damage to which this insurance could apply. As you know, in the discussions that you might have had earlier in your general liability and other insurance classes, that the duty to defend is more important in most cases to the insured than the duty to pay. Most insureds are looking for someone to defend their actions to prove that they did nothing wrong. And what we also need to remember, that if any part of the claim is covered under the liability policies that we provide, then we have to defend the whole claim. We only can, at claim resolution, divide it up between what's covered or what's not covered as far as it goes to the defense. In other words, if there's a potential that part of the claim is covered and part's not covered, we have to defend the whole claim. At settlement time, we can say we're only going to pay this much, and then we're not going to pay this, and will you still settle? In those cases, the insured would have to contribute, or some other insurance carrier would have to contribute to that to get it settled. Or at judgment time, we can say our policy only covers this part of the judgment, not the other, leaving the insured with unpaid judgment. You need to remember that we do have a duty to defend, and that defense goes beyond sometimes the policy coverage in all aspects of the claim. Let's look at a situation where we have an insured that also has a service facility on their premises. They do work on owner-operators' vehicles. They do maintenance, the lease to them. It could be just maintenance that has to do with the meeting of the federal regulations to make sure the vehicle is properly maintained, so that when there is a roadside inspection, the insured does not get a violation in their CSA's scores. Let's say that this motor carrier's service operation worked on a owner-operator's brakes on April the 25th. Their insurance renews on May the 1st. So the brakes were repaired during a policy that was in effect from 5/1 to 5/1 the previous years, with a renewal being effective the next 5/1. The owner-operator gets upset with the motor carrier, and they leave the motor carrier and they cancel the lease right after the repair was done. Let's say the lease was canceled on April the 28th. Maybe they got upset with the mechanic or some other reason. After leaving and canceling the lease on May 25th, in other words, almost 3 weeks after they almost a month after they had the repair done, but after the lease was canceled, the brake job failed and caused the owner-operator to have a crash running into a vehicle on the highway. Again, the owner-operators no longer is leased to the motor carrier that did the repair work. The liability coverage of the operator addresses the claim that found the question. The auto liability coverage of the owner-operator addressed the claim, and they find out it was due to the bad repair done by the motor carrier. Then they refer the claim back to the motor carrier. And my question to you would be, which policy would have to address this claim? The one that was enforced when the repair was done, or the one that was enforced when the crash happened? This is a major consideration. We have had a lot of discussion, if you went in insurance, between an occurrence policy and a claims made policy. And the key is the wording in the who's insured provision to determine. Again, the question is, was this claim to be addressed under the policy that was enforced on April 25th when the work was done, or was the policy that the renewal of that policy on May 1st when the accident, the brake job failed and the accident occurred. As in all cases, we have to look to the policy wording. We find that the policy wording says this insurance applies to bodily injury and property damage only if the bodily injury and property damage occurs during the policy period. So therefore, the policy that would have to respond would not be the one enforced when the work was paid, but the work was done, but when the work failed and damaged the public. This is a major consideration when we write general liability, not so much in trucking as in other areas, because when you write a new policy and you are the first time writing that policy, you're picking up any bad work that that insured could have done in the previous policy periods, because the coverage is afforded to the insured based on when their work fails. This is a major consideration if you advise your insureds about accepting GL policies and having some work done by others. The work could be done by others, could be repair work where they do it outside their garage themselves, or it could be something, other things that the insured does. The important part here is whenever the insured uses a quote subcontractor to do work on their behalf, either in their facility and or on their vehicles, they need to make sure that those people are substantial enough that there would be some assurance that the person who did the work on behalf of your insured will be in business when and if that work ever failed. So the key consideration here is that the policies that will pay, and the insurance agreement says that we'll pay if the insurance applies, but the policy that has to respond is not the policy where the work was done. And by the way, where the premium was generated, because you could have had the generation of the premium, you were paid for the workers who did the work and that failed later. It's not that policy that has to pay. It will be the policy to respond, it would have to be the policy that was enforced when the work failed. Major consideration as we set up GL and concern about the exposures we're picking up when we write the risk to start with, and that is to make sure that there's not faulty work, other problems outside that were done previous to us writing the policy that might fail during our policy period. This key consideration for this section is how auto and GL work together. And so we're going to spend the balance of the time discussing this coverage concerns. First off, the definition of auto. Both forms define auto the same way. The form says both auto and GL. The auto means a land motor vehicle, trailer or semi-trailer, designed for travel on public roads, including any attachments or equipment. Then it adds under B, any other land vehicle that's subject to a compulsory or financial responsibility law or other motor vehicle insurance laws where it is licensed or principally garage. That wording was added in the GL policy in the 04 form and the auto liability policy in the 06 form. Before this was not added. Therefore, there was a question always before was this item mobile equipment or not, because it says, however, auto does not include mobile equipment. Big consideration, and the adding of 2B brings it back to financial responsibility laws or other motor vehicle insurance laws. But then the other thing is where it is licensed or principally garage. Because a lot of times we can have states that vary on what type of vehicles that might or might not have to be licensed or meet financial responsibility laws. So that's a major concern, and we'll talk about a few areas here. But also note that the auto does not include mobile equipment. So let's look at mobile equipment, and you have been provided in the outline for you this wording that I brought out of this wording is the three areas that I think that the auto liability policy and the GL liability policy would address mobile equipment or not, that has to do with the motor carrier. So the definition in the general liability form and the same definition that you'll find in the auto liability form says mobile equipment means any of the following type of land vehicles, including any attached machinery or equipment. The first definition is farm equipment. Farm equipment can be equipment that is used on the highway to move the farm. It could be a combine in the middle part of the country. It could be custom harvesting. It could be like in Florida, we use goats. In fact, I had a special program at one time with harvesters that insured goats, and my insurance carrier, not understanding what goats were, even charged a premium to animal mortality. This program was the previous policy terms, meaning it was done before these changes were made, and therefore that goat, which is usually a one-ton truck with no cab that has a lifting device on the back that picks up the oranges or the grapefruits or the citrus from the field in the field and to dump it on a large tractor trailer while on the field. But to move from farm to farm, you had the two options. They could drive it on the highway, and because it is a motorized vehicle under Florida law, it would have to be licensed and therefore have to have insurance, or you can move it with a blow boy or other kind of trucks. Most of the time, or a lot of times, our insured moved it on the highway. Therefore, if it had an auto loss on the highway, it was before the change in the coverage form in 04 and 06. It was a general liability coverage, but now it's not. It is a auto liability coverage because that farm equipment has to be licensed for the highway. And therefore it's now, even though it meets the definition of mobile equipment, it will not be considered mobile equipment because of that concern. The next definition is one that a lot of our insureds have. Vehicles maintained for use solely on or next to premises you own or rent. Those are the yard tractors. Those are the spotting tractors. They could be called yard dogs or donkeys or something like that, where the insured keeps them in their yard to spot trailers. A lot of times they're not even licensed for the road, and those trailers move around the premises to spot trailers as needed. Those units are, again, used on the insured's premises. The question I have is, you ask the insured, do they have these tractors? Yes. Then you ask them the question, do they ever leave the premise? And all your insurers are going to say, oh, no, they do that. Then my next question is, well, how do you maintain them? How do you fuel them? Can they leave the premises? Because my concern is if they leave the premises, and even though they're not licensed, if they leave the premises other than going across the street to park the trailers in the yard that the insured also owns or rents, if they do those beyond that, then they are subject to financial responsibility even though they're not licensed. So that's a big exposure that you might have with insurance. The other one that might be involved in it is under D, vehicles, whether self-propelled or not, maintained primarily to provide mobility to permanently mounted. Key here is self-propelled. And the two that we'll talk about later is power cranes and drill rigs. These are the heavy haulers will have a crane. The crane moves from job site to job site. They move on the highway. We've all have seen them on the highway, and they're most of the time in most jurisdictions they have to be licensed for the road. Previous to the change in the wording, we covered that exposure even on the highway under GL. But now, because it has to be licensed, that power crane is considered an auto and not mobile equipment because of that definition. The other one that we talk about here will be a drill rig. Clients who are drilling water wells or oil wells. This is big business in Texas and North Dakota, parts of Pennsylvania, and other parts of our country now that we have the trying to provide the fuel and gas on a domestic basis and not import them. Most of those insureds that do business in those areas have not only the drill rigs, but have trucks that support the drill rigs, or a lot of times could even be a motor carrier moving items to and from the job sites, as well as the drill rigs. Those drill rigs, again, operating on the highway, would have to be licensed for the road. A lot of them are mobile. A lot of them can be moved on the highway. They're self-contained. And so those are the concerns. So looking at these definitions, the four areas that I find that might have exposure for insureds would be three of them if they have a mixed operation. They are farming, harvesting, working agriculture, have both tractor trailers and equipment that provide services to the farm or harvesting and other entities. What we point out here is a tractor trailer is clearly your auto, but that farm machinery also might be considered auto, not mobile equipment, if it has to be licensed for the road. Same thing with heavy haulers with power cranes and drilling operations with drill rigs. The fourth area, though, is also vehicles maintained for use solely on premises. Those are yard tractors and spotting tractors and things like that. So when we talk about the insured, if they have the mixed operations, they do work in farming, they are heavy haulers, or they drill rigs, you need to address these auxiliary type equipment that might be having to be scheduled in auto policy, and if they have yard tractors. Most insurance carriers you have a reduced rate. The advisor rate ISO used to use is 15% of the power rate for these equipments. The other thing that we'll talk about later in our discussion is when those equipment get to the job site, or get to the farm, get to the drilling operation, and now being used, is that GL or auto. We'll talk about that also. So we'll remind you again, the end of the wording of the mobile equipment. It adds the same wording that you had in the definition of mobile equipment. However, mobile equipment does not include any land vehicle that are subject to compulsory and financial responsibility laws or other motor vehicle insurance laws where its license or principally garage. Land vehicles subject to a compulsory or financial law or other mobile vehicle insurance laws are considered autos. So that's the discussion to go through to decide that. So remember again, for the insurance to apply, it applies if it's not excluded. The only exclusion that you have in the general liability policy is exclusion G. This exclusions auto liability. What's excluded in G is addressed by auto liability coverage form. This is the exclusion that has the auto liability and the GL working together, and so that's a key consideration. So let's look at G. And again on exclusion G, we exclude auto, aircraft, watercraft. Bodily injury property arising out of ownership, maintenance, use, and entrustment to others of any auto. Notice autos in quotation. That gets back to the definitions that we just were provided here. And so whether it's a yard tractor, whether it's a drill rig, whether it's the crane, or where things are simply, you know, even on the highway we've seen front-end loaders and we've seen big off-road equipment on highways again, that will be the determination here because we're now excluding this. But that's where people usually stop. But that's not a major concern here. It's only autos that are owned by, operated by, rented, or loaned to any insured. And we also have operations include loading and unloading, which is a defined term. So it's not that we exclude auto, and again, that definition of auto is important because that would determine which policy will respond to those items that we just went through. But it's only autos owned by, operated by, rented, or loaned to any insured. Remember, insured is also including employees, so this would exclude any employees that your insured has for their autos also. And so that's the key definition here. And we'll look at this in more detail later, but just remember, it's only autos owned by, operated by, rented, or loaned to an insured. Looking at this exclusion also, it says this exclusion applies even if claim against any insured alleges negligence or other wrongdoing in supervision, hiring, employment, training, or monitoring of others by that insured. If the occurrence was caused the bodily injury or property damage involved the ownership, maintenance, and use, and entrustment to others of any auto owned by, operated by, rented, or loaned to any insured. The concern here is the hiring standards required under CDL. For you that have been to my classes before or to other knowledge of this knows that there's two components of hiring a driver of a vehicle whose GVW is 26,001 or larger. That driver must have a commercial driver's license. As a part of that screening process, that the potential new employer must do a background check, must verify employment from the previous employers, must drug test, must have a copy of MVR and do certain other things. Before this wording was added to the policy, again around 2004, there was cases that came up that said the accident was caused by the bad driver, and that auto claim had to be paid under auto liability. But also there's another separate negligent act, tort act, done by the insured, and that's because they put the wrong driver there. And there was a couple of court cases that said that these policies then would stack. The auto policy would cover the liability caused by the driver driving the vehicle, and the general liability policy would add more dollars to cover the insured for having the wrong driver behind the wheel. ISO attempted to correct this by changing this wording in the policy that says no, 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 it's all auto. We're not going to pick up the not supervising, not negligent handling of an insured under the GL policy allowed to be stacked. However, there is a concern that we have here. It's only autos owned by, operated, rented, or loaned to any insured. So the two scenarios we have here is, as a part of the CDL employment criteria, you know that or should know that the potentially new employer must ask the insured, who did you work for, the potential employee, who did you work for the last 3 years, and how may I contact them, and how long did you work for them? During those last 3 years, did you fail or refuse any drug tests, and did you have any accidents that were at fault or not? And then the potentially new employer, which should be your insured in this case, has 30 days to verify that information that the potential driver told them about as a part of the hiring process. Now, your insured can go ahead and take the driver's word and said, okay, we'll take your word, we'll give you a conditional job offer, we'll let you drive, but we are going to verify this information. And if we find any variance in this information different from what you told us, then we'll discuss your employment, and you might lose your job because of this false information. And then your insured contacts now the new employer, this driver contacts the previous employer, and the previous employer doesn't tell them about the failed drug test. Let's say they ignore it, they've had the form, or they don't want the hassle. They might not even think they have to tell it under privacy laws, even though that's wrong. Under the sakes of safety of the commercial driver's license, they must divulge this information, and they get immunity from privacy when they do so. So let's say this previous employer, who is who has a general liability policy, fails to report this. The new employer goes ahead and hires a driver. The driver then has later an auto accident involving the use of drugs, and now the owner, the new employer of this driver, is on the witness stand, and they're asked the question, why did you drive this driver when he had or she had a previous failed drug test? And then, of course, this employee would say, because the previous employer didn't tell me about it. So the previous employer driver now is brought into this general liability policy in the suit, and that is a general liability coverage, so not divulging this information here. You also know that in some brokerage operations, they are alleged that the broker operation is involving dangerous entrustment, negligent supervision, and those things too. And so that would be a second exposure here. And we'll talk in more detail about that, but that's a major concern. We also talked about earlier some of this equipment that we have can operate on the highway, as well as but also have operation equipment. And so also this exclusion, and the general liability policy has auto liability policy has the same wording in it. It takes coverage away, and it says here this exclusion does not apply, meaning that we're still covering under GL the operation of machinery or equipment attached to this licensed mobile equipment. So when moving to the job on the highway is auto, operating equipment is GL. So exclusion G of the GL to work with the auto policy excludes only autos owned by, operated, rented, or loaned to an insured. So let's say your insured has a working facility. They work on autos they don't own. Could be owner-operators, or it could be just a simple garage operation. we get often, do we also need a separate garage policy? The answer to that question is no, because all that the garage does except test driving a vehicle is covered under the general liability policy. Because if I have someone on my premises who trips and falls, that's clearly covered under GL. If a brake job like the one that we gave you example earlier failed later, then the vehicle is not being operated by your insured with the garage operation. It is not owned by your insured with the garage operation. It is not rented to your insured with the garage operation. It's not loaned to your insured with the garage operation. So therefore, that failed work is covered under their GL. The only thing that's not covered is test driving a vehicle and or picking up and delivering of a vehicle. Also, it's not covered, the garage keeper's liability for having the vehicle in their possession is also not covered. Those can be written on a general liability policy, but everything the garage does other than test driving a non-owned auto is covered under the general liability policy. Brokerage. A lot of discussion on this, and I'm not attempting to suggest that the contingency brokerage policies out there are not needed and should not be used, but brokerage also is covered under the general liability. Because if I have a load that needs to be delivered, and that load, I call up Jones Trucking to deliver that load, and Jones Trucking takes that load down the highway and has an accident, could I be named as a broker in the suit? The answer to that question is yes. Second question is, however, is that truck that Jones Trucking is operating, do I own it as a broker? Do I operate it as a broker? Is it loaned to me or rented to me? And the answer to that question is no. So therefore, my general liability policy will address my exposure as a broker for brokering that load to a motor carrier. It will also cover even if a part of the claim is because of dangerous entrustment, negligent supervision, because again, that auto that caused the accident is not an auto that I owned, I operated, was loaned, or rented to me as a broker. So that's the other area of coverage here. The next one we already talked about is not providing previous employees questions from possible new employers that again could be brought into the court case that we talked about earlier where your insured could still be liable. And the last thing we need to look at is the definition of loading and unloading by mechanical device not attached to the unit. GL coverage, but not if information given to another trucker and the other trucker also causes the accident. This is the higher responsibility of the public, not covered if auto is owned by, operated by, rented, loaned. But if required, information not furnished about previous employee, information not furnished contributes to an auto accident caused by an auto not owned, operated, rented, or leased to the insured, there could be coverage. When mobile equipment meets definition auto and it's equipment that also performs operation, it's the road operation is auto, the use of the equipment is GL. Let's take some examples. A gas hauler. While unloading the gas into a tank, fumes come up from the tank. Someone puts a quarter in a vacuum, and which caused the fumes to the vacuum to spark, igniting the fumes and hurting the persons and the driver. Is this an auto claim, the damage done to the public and the driver, or is it a GL claim? And how do we pay for the injuries to the public and potentially the injuries to the driver? Think about it. Just make a check mark. We'll come back and address it later. Next example. The insured parks their truck in the supermarket parking lot. The insured is a beer distributor. They're unloading a hand truck full of beer. Their truck's parked in the parking lot some 100 feet from the entrance. They go into the store and taking this hand truck full of beer, takes a turn down an aisle on the way to the cooler where the beer is going to be ended up to be delivered. Someone is bending down, picking picking up a can of peas, and the insured wipes her ankle out. Insured runs over the ankle with a hand truck full of beer. Is this auto or general liability? Think about it. We'll visit answer later. You have a flatbed operator. They have a forklift hanging on the back of the trailer, called a donkey in most cases. While driving down the highway, the forklift falls off the back of the trailer, hits the car next to it, causing that car to have an accident. Is this auto or general liability? Again, the forklift is not licensed for the road, therefore it is mobile equipment. Again, is that auto or general liability? Let's say the flatbed didn't have that accident, the forklift didn't fall off, so they take the forklift to the job site. They unload the forklift, take it down from the how it's hung on the back. They start unloading pallets of sod. While unloading the sod, the operator of the forklift runs over a mailbox and drops oil on the driveways of a gated community. Again, damage to the mailbox, damage to the driveways in the community. Is that auto or GL? We have a concrete box company. They have a unit that is a flatbed with a loading and unloading device attached to the flatbed when the blocks are carried. In other words, it's one unit. You have the crane that is attached to, or the lifting device is attached to the flatbed, trackbed, straight truck, and they have blocks from. Your insured gets to the job site. They start unloading the blocks. As they unload the blocks, one of those blocks falls off and hits a worker standing next to the truck. That driver being hit by those blocks falling off while it's being unloaded with that apparatus attached to the equipment. Is this auto or GL? The insured's a hay hauler. They're taking an air conditioning unit to a job site on a flatbed they own. They also have a motorized crane licensed for road use following the flatbed hauling the air conditioning unit. The crane drops something as it's running down the highway and damages somebody. The crane on the highway does injury while it's running down the highway. Is this auto or GL for the damage done by the crane? At job site, the flatbed stops. The crane pulls up next to the flatbed, puts down the outriggers, and lifts the air conditioning unit. While in the air conditioning unit comes loose and hits a subcontractor's worker on the head while sitting on the ground. The damage to that worker, is that auto or GL? The damage to the air conditioning unit, how is that covered? Is that auto, GL, or somewhere else? So we have two questions here. The damage done by the dropping of the air conditioning unit from the crane. And second is the damage done to the item being lifted. Let's look at the definition of loading, unloading. The general liability wording, exclusion G excludes operations of autos owned by, operated, loaned, or rented to an insured, and operation includes loading and unloading. Loading and unloading means the hauling of property after it's moved from the place where it is accepted for movement onto or into an auto, while it is on the auto, or while it's being moved from the auto to the place where it's finally delivered. So what this says is that that there's no coverage on the general liability after the item is moved from the place where it's accepted for movement on the auto, while it's being transported or while it's being unloaded until it gets to the final delivered. But loading and unloading does not include movement of property by means of mechanical devices other than a hand truck that's not attached to an aircraft, watercraft, or auto. So if the loading and unloading device is attached to the unit itself, then it is still it is covered on the auto, not the general liability. Or if being unloaded by hand or hand truck, it is also still auto liability. The auto liability exclusion that mirrors the loading and unloading definition is the exclusion 7 or 8 in the auto policy, which says we exclude bodily injury property resulting from the handling of property before it's moved to a place where it's accepted by the insured for movement into or onto a covered auto, or after it's moved from the covered auto to a place where it's finally delivered by the insured, and bodily injury property damage resulting from an exclusion 8, movement of property by a mechanical device other than a hand truck unless the device is attached to the covered unit. So what this is saying is that before the move start, if something happens, it's GL, meaning it stacks up there, somebody trips on it and falls on it, it's GL. But once it's started to be moved, in other words, the insured takes possession of it, moves it to their vehicle, then if it's damaged moving to the vehicle, then it's covered under the auto. Once it's at the location or being carried, it's auto. When it gets to the location, it's auto until it gets to its final areas, as long as it's being loaded, unloaded by hand, or a device attached to the unit, it's still auto. If it's unloaded by an item not attached, and the 3 items I've used there would be a crane, a front-end loader, or a back forklift, then it is covered under the GL, not auto. So the two work together. When truck is being loaded and unloading, what form addresses damage to the public, automobile general liability during the process? The item, so therefore it is before it's moved, it's GL liability. After it takes it to the final destination, it's general liability. During the move, it's auto. If it's being unloaded by hand or hand truck or an apparatus attached to the unit, it's still auto, but it's being removed, being loaded and unloaded, moved when the item not attached to the auto, forklift, front-end loader, or crane, then it's GL. The item being loaded and unloaded is not covered because of the care control exclusion. That's a Bailey, a cargo coverage. The example I gave you earlier, the crane is sometimes called a hook coverage, but it's nothing but an marine installation type floater. Any damage done while items are being loaded and unloaded before move starts is GL. When move starts, first touch to start moving auto. If moving by hand truck or equipment attached to the auto until the item move reaches its final destination. After final destination, that then excluded on the AL, and GL now picks it up. So that's completed operation. If moved by mechanical device is not attached, then GL. Again, that's how the two work together. So let's go back to our example, the gas hauler. We're unloading the gas by hand. We're unloading gas into the tank. While unloading the gas into the tank, if it damages something in the tank, say the tank is diesel and our insured inadvertently loads it into gas into that diesel tank, it contaminates the diesel in there and damages the tank, that's auto. While the fumes are coming up while unloading and it sparks, then that would be auto. But if the fumes hit the bottom of the tank and came back up, that would be GL. How in the world can you sort that out? This was actually a case that I was an expert witness in to determine those things. That's like Solomon splitting the baby. There's no right answer. However, now if the gas is in the diesel and now it's being used and damages an engine later, then that is GL. So the gasoline's being loaded and unloaded by unloaded by hand. If the gasoline damages the tank or damages the diesel fuel already in the tank, then that is an auto claim. If the fumes coming out are due to the unloading of the gas, then that would also be an auto claim causing the fire. If the fumes came after the gas hit the bottom of the tank, then that would be GL. If the gas is being used and now put in a diesel truck, then that would also be GL. So if fumes came from unloading a tank, that's auto. If after the gas, that's GL. Beer delivery, damage to the lady picking up the peas, that's auto. Why? Because we're unloading by a hand truck. A hand truck you see attached on the front. A hand truck could be a non-motorized pallet jack. Hand truck could even be a wheelbarrow if we have concrete workers. So unloading that beer in that supermarket, even though the truck was some 100 yards away from the delivery place accident, then that is auto. But once after getting to the cooler and the beer that we stacked up, the insured stacks up, falls down now and hurts an employee of the store, then that becomes GL. The forklift falling off the flatbed, that's auto. The provision C for liability coverage only in the auto form says the movement of towing or hauling mobile equipment is considered liability under the auto form if it falls off. That's auto. The damage to the mailbox taking the forklift down after taking down is GL. The oil leaking from the forklift, again, is GL. So the forklift falling off while being moved is auto, but while the forklift is being used to load and unload, then it's GL. The damage to the forklift clearly is covered, is not covered under the auto or GL form, even if the insured did not own the forklift. Again, the same discussion we had earlier. It is because of the care, custody, control. Unloading concrete blocks with a lift device attached to the flatbed, which also carried the blocks. Those blocks falling off, hurting the worker, that is auto liability because we're unloading with a device attached to it. Now the blocks are on the ground and the stack now falls over, then that's GL. The crane going to the job site, because it has to be licensed and it runs into somebody, that's auto liability. At the job site, now using the crane, damage done by the air conditioner being dropped off, that's general liability. Damage to the air conditioner itself is not covered because the care, custody, control exclusion, that's Bailey and marine coverage. It could be a cargo policy or, in most cases, an insulation floater that would cover those things. So when we look at our insurance operations, look at the motor carriers, let's talk about the need to make sure our insureds have auto and general liability. Clearly we see it's overlapping here, but let's talk about some of the exposures here. If you have a drop and hook operation, this is where the driver does not load or unload. The driver just backs into a loaded trailer, takes it down the highway to another point down the highway, drops that trailer off, and then to pick up another one. They don't have any responsibility for loading and unloading, so therefore their general liability exposure is minimal from the point of loading and unloading. What type of operations does insured have, in lots of cases, responsible for loading and unloading? A dry van operator. A lot of times the driver has a requirement to load or unload the van. Typically it could be done by a hand truck, a lot of cases, or non-motorized jack. That would then be the auto liability if they damage something. If it has to be loaded and unloaded by a forklift that's motorized, then that would be GL. So again, you need to ask your insured, if they're not a drop and hook operation, what's the responsibility for the driver to load and unload those items, and if so, how they're done. A tanker, gasoline, food products, any kind of tanker. Typically we unload and load tankers by hand, and therefore if damage is done, then unloading what's being unloaded escapes, then that's an auto loss. After the items are delivered in a wrong place or tank, then that becomes a GL exposure. flatbed. Even the forklift is carried, but to use it, it has to be taken down and then start to unload. That's GL. Live animals, control while loading and unloading. The example I have given before in classes is we're unloading a horse to take to the horse show. As we're unloading the horse, taking it to the barn for so I can stay overnight for the show the next day, the horse bolts, hurting the public. Is that auto or GL? A lot of people think it's GL. No, it's auto because we're unloading the horse by hand and we haven't taken it to the barn yet. So that's auto. If we take it to the barn and then forget to secure the gate and it comes back out, that becomes GL. Auto haulers. Autos until it's the final delivery location, because we're unloading the auto by hand, even though you only have several specified autos only. Even if you don't have non-owned autos, it's still covered under the auto form. Not the damage to the auto, that's cargo, but the damage done by the auto being delivered and undelivered by hand. Heavy haulers and dump operators. These are people who have loading and unloading devices not attached to the unit. They could be a crane, they could be a front loader, they could be a forklift. Crane operator, crane attached to a power unit that carries items to be loaded and unloaded. Could be a roofing operation, the concrete block operation, the plywood. Again, more exposure there because that is auto under the auto form, less under the GL. So we need to look through those and say, yeah, I understand why people say a drop and hook operation does not need GL. But anybody who has any responsibility for loading and unloading by any type of device has a general liability exposure. So therefore, going back to our previous statement, don't underwrite this risk in a vacuum. You need to make sure that the insured has auto and GL. Motor carriage operation, while auto while moving, GL while at locations and when operating as a crane. Same for drill rigs and farm equipment. So the definition of auto states vary on requirements of units to be licensed and meet financial responsibility while on the roadway. So auto liability versus mobile equipment can also be dependent on where it is operating. Again, states vary. Whenever possible, auto and GL should be written with the same insurance carrier. General liability only excludes autos owned by, operated, rented, or loaned to an insured. Insured includes employees, so non-owned coverage on auto form will address employees' use of non-owned autos. But other than the employees' non-owned autos, the general liability policy covers other non-owned exposures. Garage operations is GL. No need for a separate garage policy. For you who don't know this, the garage policy is no longer a ISO product. It was withdrawn from the marketplace October 2013. That's another question later. They could need general liability, garage keeper's liability coverage, which can be added to the auto form, and also need to cover owned operated units or test driving non-owned units. That's also covered in auto form. Brokerage operation is GL, including damage to entrustment, because the brokerage operation is moving equipment by an auto not owned, operated, rented, or loaned to an insured. But only after the auto policy on the truck hauling the load addresses the damage. That's why you don't see many. The broker is additionally insured on the auto policy of the truck hauling the load. That policy must provide defense for the broker, and if claims settle within the limits, obtain releases from all who qualify as insured, including the broker. Then if the claim was not settled, went to judgment, or could not settle within the limits, then the broker's GL will be in excess of the truck's auto liability policy hauling the load. Not screening an employee is not covered under GL properly. It's auto exposure, but not responding to an inquiry of a previous employee and that information is not divulged, and therefore hiring was done, and because it would not have been done if they knew it, then that becomes GL. If GL and auto are meant to work together, then they should be with the same carrier. So at loss time, there's not a question of coverage, just what line of coverage will pay. So again, use of mobile equipment is auto. Complete operation, is GL, forklifts, front ends, and cranes. Complete operation is GL. Once we take it to the final destination, then it's GL. Auto-related damage caused by auto not owned and operated or rented or loaned to the insured. Brokerage, garage operation is GL. So loading and unloading using a device not attached to the truck or trailer, forklift, front end loader, crane, that's GL. Erroneous delivery of products, including liquids, delivered of products damaged in shipment, then that again is GL. The motor carrier performs repair of vehicles not owned, that's GL. Sells an extra tire, that's GL. I'm going through the things at the end of the first section is where the why an insured needs a GL policy. Failure to disclose drug problems of previous employee, that's GL. Insured is sued because of someone else's auto accident, that's brokerage again, vicarious liability, that's GL. Insured owns or uses mobile equipment, forklift, loaders, etc., that's GL. At least offer the coverage to prevent E&O exposure. If insured has a loss, you will be likely to be involved. You need to get the money and provide the coverage. So those are why the motor carrier needs both an auto liability policy and a GL, and how the two work together from the auto exposure and the GL exposure. We hope you find this beneficial. We'll have section 3 that will come up next month. We wish you all a good day.